The sky didn't tear open all at once. That was the lie people liked to tell afterward, the comfortable fiction of a cinematic ending. They spoke of thunder like the voice of God, of clouds splitting into jagged veins of fire, of a singular, terrifying moment where humanity looked up and knew the world was ending. It made the tragedy feel inevitable, a cosmic judgment. In truth, the end was quieter. It was a masterpiece of human arrogance, wrapped in the shimmering promise of a technological miracle. The day the weather nanobots were launched, the sky looked almost kind. Bailey remembered the quality of the light with a clarity that still cut through her dreams. The clouds had been stretched thin and pale, like brushed cotton pulled across a loom. The sun wasn't blotted out. It was softened, diffused into a gentle, pearlescent glow that made the world feel safe. It was early summer in the Pacific Northwest, warm but not yet punishing. The air felt full instead of heavy, smelling of cut grass, and the ozone of distant managed rain. It was the kind of day where people still believed tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday, only better. She was 16 then. She was old enough to understand the mechanics of the world, the dying reefs, the scorched plains, the rising tides, but young enough to believe that a sufficiently clever machine could fix it. The launch had been a global spectacle, a choreographed symphony of hope. Every screen in every time zone carried the feed. Presidents and prime ministers stood shoulder to shoulder, a fragile, desperate illusion of unity, promising a solution to the climate collapse that had been choking cities and swallowing farmland whole. Weather stabilization, the banners read. The Great Correction, they spoke of billions of microscopic nanobots, a silver mist released into the upper atmosphere. These tiny sentinels were designed to regulate global temperature, to break apart supercells before they could flatten cities, to usher moisture toward the parched throats of the dust bowls. It was a technological salvation. No more floods swallowing children in their sleep. No more droughts turning breadbaskets into graveyards. Bailey had watched from the cracked leather of her mother's couch, her knees tucked to her chest, her phone humming with the excitement of a billion likes. Across the small apartment, her mother stood in the kitchen, a silhouette against the dim light. She hadn't joined the celebration. Her arms were crossed tight, her eyes narrowed at the screen with a deep-seated ancestral suspicion. "Nothing that big comes without a price, Bailey," her mother had said, her voice like dry leaves. Bailey had rolled her eyes, the arrogance of youth a shield against the truth. "You say that about everything, Mom. You're just afraid of progress." Her mother didn't smile. She didn't even argue. She just looked at the screen, and for a second, she looked like she was mourning someone who hadn't died yet. That should have been the first warning. The first changes weren't dramatic. That was the second lie humanity told itself to keep from screaming. For months, the project seemed like an unqualified success. The storms did stop. The atmospheric pressure evened out into a perpetual, pleasant spring. The air felt cleaner, lighter, as if the planet had taken a long, careful breath after being strangled for a century. Crops that had been shriveled for years suddenly surged toward the sun. The great wildfires of the West slowed to a crawl and then went out, starved of the erratic winds that fed them. People danced in the streets of San Francisco and Mumbai. They called it the Second Eden, and then the reports started trickling in, the glitches in the miracle. They were scattered at first, easily dismissed as outliers or the lingering effects of pre-correction stress. A man in Chicago was hospitalized after a sudden, violent episode. He had torn a steel door off its hinges with his bare hands, his eyes dilated until the irises disappeared. A woman in London collapsed in a subway station, overwhelmed by a sensory hallucination of smells, fears, pheromones, and filth, despite the sterile air. A teenager in Berlin attacked a classmate, tearing at his throat with teeth that seemed suddenly, terrifyingly sharp. The word feral started trending on social media before the scientists even had a name for the pathology. Then came the biology. The world's top endocrinologists and neurologists began seeing patterns that defied the laws of nature. There were massive hormonal spikes that didn't match any known disorder. Brain scans revealed that the nanobots hadn't just stayed in the clouds. They had entered the water table, the food chain, and the very lungs of the population. They were interacting with human DNA, acting as catalysts for an ancient, dormant genetic script. New neural pathways were lighting up, regions linked to primal aggression, hyperacute scent recognition, and complex social hierarchies. Geneticists found junk DNA sequences activating for the first time in millennia. It took 6 months before the world heard the words that would redefine humanity: Alpha, Beta, Omega. At first, it sounded like a joke. A dark meme. Internet nonsense, dragged into the light of serious news broadcasts. Bailey remembered laughing about it with her friends in the school gym. They were sitting on the bleachers during one of the civic order drills that had become mandatory as the world grew twitchier. "They've officially lost it," Tamsin had said, showing Bailey a grainy video of a man in New York claiming he could smell the fear of the police officers surrounding him. "Next they'll tell us we're actually werewolves and we need to howl at the moon." Bailey laughed so hard her stomach hurt. "I'll be a poodle, less maintenance." 3 days later, Tamsin presented as an alpha during history class. It started with the scent. Bailey didn't have a name for it then, but she felt the shift in the air. It grew thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The classroom, usually smelling of floor wax and stale teenagers, was suddenly overwhelmed by something sharp, metallic, and predatory. Bailey's heart began to race. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was a physical response to a chemical command. She became acutely aware of the pulse in Tamsin's neck, the heat radiating off her skin. Tamsin doubled over, her breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. When the teacher reached out to touch her shoulder, Tamsin didn't just push him away. She screamed, a sound that wasn't human, a guttural roar of pure dominance, and shoved her heavy oak desk with such force, it shattered against the far wall. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the screaming began. By the end of that week, the schools were shuttered. By the end of the month, the cities were burning. The classifications spread like a plague, uneven and unpredictable. Most of the population, the betas, remained largely unchanged, caught in the middle of a world that was rapidly turning into a predatory ecosystem. They were the witnesses, the victims, and eventually, the fodder. But the alphas and omegas were the ones who rewrote history. Alphas emerged with a violent suddenness. They were stronger, faster, and possessed an instinctual need for territory and control. In the vacuum left by collapsing governments, they became warlords, gang leaders, or protectors who demanded a high price for their service. Then came the omegas. And for them, the apocalypse was a different kind of hell. Omegas were rarer, their presentations quieter but far more dangerous to themselves. Their bodies became biological beacons, emitting pheromones that could trigger alphas into a frenzy of possessive rage. Their hormonal cycles, heats, destabilized them, leaving them vulnerable in a world that had lost its capacity for mercy. The first Omega riots didn't happen because of politics. They happened in refugee camps where the scent of a single presenting Omega turned an entire facility into a bloodbath of competing alphas. Bailey's own presentation came late. It was the only reason she was still alive. She was 18, living in a barricaded apartment with her mother. The world outside was a wasteland of roving packs and silent ruins, but inside, they had tried to keep a sliver of the old world alive. She woke in the middle of a Tuesday night, drenched in a sweat that smelled sickly sweet, like crushed lilies and copper. Her skin didn't just itch, it burned, as if her nerves were being rewired by a live current. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a jet engine. The smell of the old wallpaper was nauseating. Her mother was in the room in seconds, a wet cloth in her hand and terror in her eyes. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." But the correction was complete. Bailey's body had cracked open. The scent hit the small room like a physical blow. Even her mother, a beta, recoiled from the sheer potency of it. Bailey felt a terrifying emptiness opening up inside her, a biological craving for protection, for a presence she couldn't name. Her mother acted with the desperate efficiency of a woman who had seen the news. She blacked out the windows with duct tape. She wrapped Bailey in blankets soaked in industrial bleach and ammonia to mask the scent. They huddled in the bathtub, the only place that felt remotely like a fortress. They didn't sleep. They listened to the sounds of the night, the distant growl of engines, the occasional howl, the sound of boots on the pavement 3 floors down. The next morning, someone reported the sweet smell coming from 4B. The men who broke down the door weren't soldiers. They were enforcers, civilians who had embraced the new hierarchy. They wore mismatched armor and carried assault rifles like they were religious icons. Bailey's mother stood in the hallway, a kitchen knife in one hand and a heavy iron skillet in the other. She looked tiny against the 3 alphas who filled the doorway. "She's sick," her mother screamed, her voice cracking. "She's just a kid with a fever. Get out!" The lead man, a massive individual with eyes that glowed with an unnatural, predatory light, took a long, slow breath. He closed his eyes, a look of pure, dark ecstasy crossing his face. "Omega," he rasped. It wasn't a word. It was a claim. The gunshot that followed was the loudest thing Bailey had ever heard. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like the world snapping in half. She didn't see her mother fall. She only saw the blood, a bright, vibrant red that looked wrong against the dull linoleum. She didn't think. The Omega instinct, usually associated with submission, flared into a desperate, frantic need for survival. She bolted. She scrambled out the fire escape, her bare feet cutting on the rusted metal. She ran through alleys choked with trash and the bones of the old world, She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, until the city blurred into a haze of smoke and screams. She was found by Mara, a beta woman who lived in the crawlspaces of a collapsed library. Mara didn't want to stray, but she saw the look in Bailey's eyes, the look of someone who had watched the light go out of the world. "You have to hide the smell," Mara told her, shoving a handful of foul-smelling grease and dirt into Bailey's hands. "If they scent you, you aren't a person anymore. You're a prize." And prizes get broken. The decade that followed was a masterclass in disappearance. The world collapsed with a terrifying speed. Governments tried to register the new classifications, but you can't register a wildfire. Nuclear strikes erased several major hubs in a futile attempt to sanitize the outbreak, leaving behind jagged skylines of glass and ash. And through it all, the weather nanobots kept working. That was the ultimate irony. Above the ruins of Chicago and the mass graves of Paris, the skies remained perfectly, mockingly blue. The temperature stayed at a steady 72 degrees. The wind never rose above a gentle breeze. The planet was a pristine, climate-controlled cage for the monsters humanity had become. Bailey grew up in the shadows. She learned the gray routes, the paths through the ruins where the wind patterns favored those trying to hide their scent. She learned how to scavenge for suppressants, black market pills, or chemical cocktails that could mute the omega signals. She learned to fight like a cornered animal. She wasn't strong like an alpha, but she was fast, and she had the desperate cunning of the hunted. By 24, she had joined a small collective of ghosts, mostly betas and hidden omegas, living in a collapsed maintenance tunnel beneath a defunct shopping mall. They lived by a code of silence. They used charcoal and chemical waste to mask their living quarters. They never stayed above ground after the sun hit the horizon. Life was a cycle of hunger, fear, and the grinding labor of staying alive. Bailey spent her days stripping copper wire from the walls and her nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was the last person who remembered what it felt like to not be afraid. She had become an expert at the mute. She kept her hair short, her skin grimy, and her clothes baggy. She moved with a stiff, guarded gait, mimicking the unremarkable posture of a beta. To the world, she was just another scavenger. But the biology was a ticking clock. Every few months, despite the suppressants, the heat would begin to pulse in her blood. She would lock herself in a ventilated sub-basement, biting down on a leather strap to keep from crying out as her body tried to signal a mate that didn't exist. She hated her body. She hated the nanobots. She hated the silent blue sky. The end of her sanctuary came on a Tuesday, exactly 10 years to the day after her mother had died. It wasn't a mistake of scent. It was a betrayal of steel. Bailey was in the main chamber, sorting through a haul of canned peaches and rusted batteries, when the vibration hit. It wasn't the rumble of a distant storm. There were no storms anymore. It was the rhythmic, heavy thud of pressurized boots. The hunters had arrived. They weren't the disorganized alphas of the early collapse. These were the New Dawn Enforcers, a paramilitary group that had unified the alpha warlords under a single, terrifying banner. They used drone technology and biosensors that could pick up a trace of omega pheromones even through a foot of concrete. "Breach!" Mura's voice rang out, sharp and panicked. The reinforced steel door at the end of the tunnel didn't just open, it exploded inward, the pressure wave tossing Bailey against the jagged remains of a display case. Through the dust and the strobe lights of the tactical teams, Bailey saw them. They wore black carbon fiber armor and helmets with glowing red visors. They didn't move like men, they moved like a single, predatory organism. Bailey scrambled toward the emergency exit, a narrow vertical shaft that led to the sewers, but a flashbang grenade detonated, turning the world into a white-hot scream. She felt hands on her, heavy, iron-grip hands. She fought, she bit, she kicked, she clawed at the black armor, her omega instincts finally snapping into a blinding, white-hot rage. She managed to pull the helmet off one of the attackers, revealing a face that was young, scarred, and terrifyingly calm. The man didn't flinch. He leaned in, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent beneath the dirt and the chemicals. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "We've been looking for a healthy one," he whispered. The butt of a rifle slammed into the side of her head. The world didn't go black all at once. It faded slowly, like the sun setting behind the nanobot clouds. The last thing Bailey felt was the cold floor of the tunnel and the sensation of being lifted, not like a person, but like a piece of salvaged equipment. Above them, the sky remained perfectly clear, a vast and indifferent blue, as Bailey was carried out of the dark and into a new kind of nightmare. Consciousness returned to Bailey in agonizing pieces, each fragment a shard of pain. The first sensation was not sound, but a pervasive pressure, a low, constant vibration that rattled her teeth and made her skull throb in slow, nauseating pulses. It felt as if she were trapped inside the living engine of some monstrous metal leviathan, its mechanical heart beating against her very bones. Her thoughts surfaced sluggishly, tangled and incomplete, like debris snagged in a churning current. Then came the assault of scent, a cloying cocktail of stale metal, acrid oil, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood, long baked into fabric. Over it all, the sharp, almost painful antiseptic odor of chemical suppressants, layered so thickly it burned the delicate membranes of her nose. Her stomach clenched. She tried to take a deep breath and gagged on the oppressive air. Her eyes snapped open, a violent reflex against the nausea. White, unforgiving light stabbed into her skull, an electric jolt of pain that made her cry out before she could stop herself. The sound, raw and animalistic, echoed too loudly off the hard, metallic surfaces of her prison, confirming what her body already knew. She wasn't alone. Bailey was lying on her side on a cold, unforgiving steel floor, her hands wrenched excruciatingly behind her back. Something tight and unforgiving bit into her wrists, polymer restraints, heavier and more complex than any zip ties she'd ever seen. They hummed faintly, a barely perceptible current designed to disrupt muscle response, to paralyze resistance before it could even form. She tested them instinctively, a desperate, ingrained defiance, and gasped as a sharp, lancing electricity shot up her arms, extinguishing the spark of rebellion. A transport truck. A prison on wheels. The walls were ribbed metal, scarred with the ancient wounds of impacts and streaks of dried rust. Narrow, bolted-down bench seats lined the sides, most of them occupied. Women, dozens of them, crammed into the dimly lit space. Some slumped unconscious, heads lolling at unnatural angles. Others stared at nothing with wide, hollow eyes, a terrifying blankness that spoke of unspeakable trauma. A few were crying silently, their shoulders shaking with a desolate rhythm as they tried to make themselves as small as possible, desperate not to draw the attention of their captors. Then, a flicker of familiarity. Mara, her surrogate aunt, her last connection to a life that was now utterly annihilated, was slumped against the far wall, her gray hair matted with blood, one eye swollen shut and crusted with dried tears. A wave of dizzying relief, sharp and unexpected, crashed over Bailey. A small, desperate part of her, one she thought long dead, still recognized hope. "Mara," she croaked, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, raw from the scream she didn't remember. Mara's good eye flicked toward the sound. It was cloudy with pain, but it focused on Bailey, and in its depths, Bailey saw not surrender, but a flickering ember of defiant life. "Easy, kid," Mara whispered back, her voice rough, stripped raw by the ordeal. "Don't fight the restraints. They'll just drop the current and knock you out cold." Bailey swallowed hard, her mouth tasting of ash and sour bile. Her head throbbed where the rifle butt had connected, a constant, sickening rhythm. She shifted carefully, every movement sending jolts of agony through her body as fresh bruises announced themselves, a silent tally of the violence she had endured. "How many?" Bailey asked, her voice barely audible over the truck's incessant hum. Mara's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in her cheek. 12 taken. 6 didn't make it out of the tunnels." The words landed like blunt force trauma, each one a hammer blow to Bailey's already bruised soul. 6 women. 6 faces. 6 names. 6 lives extinguished in the brutal efficiency of the raid. Bailey closed her eyes, breathing shallowly through the ache in her chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. She pictured the tunnel, the scattered supplies, the makeshift bunks, the faded murals someone had once painstakingly painted on the cold concrete walls, a desperate attempt to pretend they were still human. 10 years of hiding, 10 years of careful, desperate survival, gone in minutes. The truck lurched violently, hitting a patch of broken roadway with a jarring crash. One of the unconscious women cried out, a guttural sob, as her head struck the metal wall. No one moved to help her, not because they lacked compassion, but because the guards would see it as weakness, an act of rebellion in miniature. In this new world, compassion was a fatal luxury. Bailey forced herself to sit up, bracing against the vibrations, her gaze sweeping over the other captives. The women were a mixed bag, some betas, identifiable by their muted presence, their quiet despair. Others were omegas. You could tell by the way the guards watched them through the reinforced viewport at the front of the transport. Omegas drew longer, more calculating looks. Assessments. Calculations. Hunters. They were seated opposite the captives, their weapons, heavy, customized assault rifles, resting casually across their knees. There were 4 of them inside the truck, all wearing the same black carbon fiber armor, their red glass visors now lifted, revealing faces that were cold, professional, and disturbingly unremarkable. They weren't alphas. That realization, stark and chilling, was almost as terrifying as the capture itself. They were betas, professional, controlled, immune to the chaotic tides of pheromones and instinctual frenzy. They were the vast middle ground of humanity, once underestimated, now weaponized. They had perfected the art of dispassionate violence. One of them, the man who had ordered her tagging back at the tunnels, noticed Bailey watching. He met her gaze without expression, his eyes the color of dull steel. "You're awake," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if discussing the weather. Bailey didn't respond, her throat constricting. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with the detached curiosity of someone examining a piece of newly acquired machinery. "Healthy. That's good. Makes transport worthwhile." She felt the heat of anger flare in her chest, bright and dangerous, a spark of pure, unadulterated fury against the cold indifference. "What are you going to do with us?" He offered a faint, unsettling smile. "Depends what you're worth, Omega." The truck slowed, its engine groaning in protest. Through the small, reinforced viewport at the back, Bailey caught a glimpse of the outside world, a landscape of desolate daylight. Ruins slid past, the skeletal remains of once proud buildings, burned-out vehicles fused to the asphalt, the gray, choked outline of an old freeway half swallowed by tenacious vines and encroaching ash. She'd seen this landscape 1,000 times from the shadows, a ghost moving through a graveyard. She'd never seen it as a prisoner, chained and helpless. They stopped at a checkpoint, a fortified outpost built into the hollowed-out shell of a former industrial warehouse. Automated turrets, like mechanical gargoyles, tracked the truck's arrival with whirring efficiency. Armed guards, their armor gleaming in the harsh light, waved them through after a brief, encrypted exchange of data with the transport's driver. The heavy door slammed open with a hiss of hydraulics. Cold, dry air rushed in, carrying the familiar smell of concrete dust and ozone. Bailey squinted against the sudden, blinding brightness, her eyes still adjusted to the gloom of the truck, as calloused hands grabbed her arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. "Out," a voice barked. "No please, no question. Just command." They were lined up outside the truck, a pathetic procession, their polymer restraints still humming with their incapacitating current. Bailey swayed slightly, her equilibrium compromised, steadying herself by focusing on the cracked pavement beneath her bare feet. There were more trucks here, more prisoners. This wasn't a one-off raid, a lucky catch. This was a supply line. A methodical, ongoing operation. New Dawn was harvesting humanity. A tall man in a long, dark coat approached, his heavy boots clicking with authority against the concrete. He wore no armor, no obvious weapons, yet his presence was more intimidating than any of the armed guards. The way the enforcers straightened to attention at his approach told Bailey everything she needed to know. This man held power. Absolute power. He stopped in front of the line of captives, his gaze sweeping over them with cold, practiced efficiency, devoid of any human emotion. "Run a scan," he ordered, his voice a low, resonant rumble. A handheld device, gleaming with unearthly precision, was pressed against each captive's neck. It beeped softly, its lights flickering through color-coded results. Beta, Beta, Omega. When the scanner touched Bailey's skin, it flared a brilliant, undeniable blue. "Omega," the tech confirmed, his voice flat. The man in the long coat nodded, a subtle movement that held immense weight. "Tag her for New Dawn." Bailey's stomach dropped like a stone. She'd heard the name before. Everyone had. It was whispered in hushed tones in every survivor's hideout. New Dawn City, an alpha stronghold, a legend of impregnable walls and brutal order, built somewhere far to the east of the ruins. A place of laws written in blood, where the hierarchy of Alpha, Beta, and Omega was not a theory, but an enforced doctrine. A city that accepted Omegas, but only on its terms. She'd also heard the rumors, the dark, terrifying whispers, that no Omega ever truly left New Dawn. Not whole, not free, they were separated then. Betas pulled roughly in one direction, Omegas herded into another. Mara met Bailey's eyes as the guards dragged her away, something fierce and defiant still burning in their depths, a final, desperate spark of hope. "Survive," Mara mouthed, the word a silent prayer, a final command. Bailey nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears, her resolve hardening. The Omega group was loaded into a different transport, larger, more secure, designed for higher-value cargo. The polymer restraints were replaced with heavier, colder cuffs anchored to the reinforced floor. Suppressant gas hissed softly from vents overhead, thick enough to dull her senses, to make her limbs feel like lead, her mind hazy. They didn't want any incidents during transport. Hours blurred together, a monotonous landscape of pain and chemically induced lethargy. The road stretched endlessly beneath them, the world above ground unfolding in a series of broken, silent tableaux. Once, they passed the edge of a colossal crater where a city had once been, a smooth, glassy basin of fused earth that reflected the perfect, indifferent blue sky like a mockery. A testament to humanity's self-destruction, watched over by its own technological savior. Another time, they drove through a forest that had grown wild and unchecked, trees bursting through asphalt, reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. Greenery devoured the gray, a silent, natural rebellion. The world was healing. Humanity, however, was not. At some point, Bailey drifted in and out of a tormented sleep, her head lolling against the unforgiving metal wall. Dreams crept in, fractured images of her mother's cluttered kitchen, of the vibrant murals in the tunnel, of Tamsin's face, not twisted by strength she hadn't chosen, but screaming in terror. She woke abruptly, startled by shouting. The convoy had stopped. Contact left. Hostiles inbound. The truck rocked violently as something heavy struck its side, a resounding crunch of metal. Gunfire erupted, sharp and deafening, followed by the high-pitched whine of energy weapons. Bailey was thrown against the restraints, pain exploding through her shoulders, lancing down her arms. An attack. For one wild, impossible moment, hope flared in her chest, a dangerous, reckless ember. An escape? A rescue? Then, the screams started. Not human screams. Alpha roars. Guttural. Primal. Full of hunger and rage. Bailey pressed herself back against the wall, trying to become invisible as the sounds of battle raged outside, a symphony of violence. The guards inside the truck stayed perfectly still, their weapons trained on the captives, their faces impassive. "Don't even think about it," one of them said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. Through the small viewport, Bailey caught flashes of movement, figures lunging from the tree line, feral and desperate. Rogue alphas. Starving, mad with instinct, driven by the scent of omegas and the promise of a meal. They never stood a chance. The New Dawn escort responded with terrifying, clinical efficiency. Drones, sleek and deadly, deployed from the lead vehicles, their mounted weapons spitting fire and plasma, carving through the attackers with precision. The roars turned to shrieks of agony, then to silence. The aftermath was swift. The truck rolled forward again, as if nothing had happened, leaving behind only echoes and the lingering scent of death. One of the Omegas was sobbing quietly now, her shoulders shaking, lost in a private hell. Another stared straight ahead, her eyes utterly empty, her spirit having already departed. Bailey clenched her jaw, her knuckles white against the metal cuffs. This was what order looked like now. Brutal. Unflinching. Necessary, perhaps, in its own horrifying way. The city appeared on the horizon at dawn, a stark silhouette against the perpetually kind, nanobot-managed sky. At first, Bailey thought it was another mirage, a cruel trick of exhaustion and the suppressant haze. But as they drew closer, the impossible shape resolved into something unmistakably, overwhelmingly real. Walls, massive, reinforced walls of gleaming steel and scarred concrete, rose from the ground like a fortress from a forgotten, mythical age. Watchtowers bristled with advanced sensors and heavy weaponry, their optics sweeping the empty landscape. Gates, vast and impenetrable, stood tall, emblazoned with the stark sigil of New Dawn, a stylized sun rising over a broken horizon. Beyond the walls, structures climbed upward into the sky, clean lines of architecture, intact glass reflecting the dawn, lights glowing faintly even in daylight. A city, alive. The convoy slowed as it approached the outer checkpoint. Automated systems scanned the vehicles, the prisoners, the guards themselves, their silent scrutiny absolute. The gates opened with a low, resonant groan, a sound Bailey felt deep in her bones, like a tomb opening. They passed through. Inside, the air was different, cleaner, filtered, controlled. It smelled of processed oxygen, new concrete, and the faint underlying tang of technology. Bailey's breath caught as she took in the sight of it. Streets free of rubble, pristine and ordered. Buildings stood tall and unscarred, not a single shattered window in sight. People moved with purpose instead of fear. A strange, almost unsettling efficiency. Alphas, betas, and omegas walked the streets, but not freely. She saw the patterns immediately, the new laws encoded in their movements. Omegas wore identifying bands on their wrists or necks, often with small, almost invisible tags. They moved in designated lanes, always escorted or grouped, their movements constrained, their presence managed. Enforcers were everywhere, tall, silent figures in black armor, watchful, ready to enforce the unwritten rules. This wasn't chaos. This was a system, a carefully constructed, meticulously maintained cage. The truck rolled deeper into the city, past residential sectors of identical, sanitized apartments and vast industrial zones humming with unseen machinery. They were heading toward the central spire that dominated the entire skyline, a needle of steel and glass piercing the unnaturally perfect sky. That was where he lived. Bailey didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. She only felt the crushing weight of his unseen presence, a gravitational pull of power emanating from the spire, as the truck came to a final, definitive stop beneath its looming shadow. Her Omega instincts, dulled by the suppressants, stirred uneasily, whispering warnings she couldn't yet fully decipher. The heavy doors hissed open once more. "Welcome to New Dawn," one of the guards said flatly, his voice devoid of warmth or welcome. Bailey lifted her chin, meeting the city with the only weapon she had left, a fierce, unyielding defiance. Her eyes, though still aching, burned with a cold, desperate resolve. She had survived hunters in the ruins. She would survive this too, even if it meant learning, firsthand, what kind of monster ruled behind these walls, and what price the Omegas paid for this terrifying order. New Dawn did not smell like a prison. That was the first thing Bailey noticed as they were marched from the belly of the transport and into the heart of the city proper. She had expected the familiar, wretched bouquet of the apocalypse, the scent of wet rot, the metallic tang of drying blood, and the sharp acidic sweat of people living on the ragged edge of extinction. Instead, the air here was filtered to the point of being tasteless, scrubbed of every organic trace, and carrying only a faint, pressurized tang of recycled minerals and chilled carbon. It was the smell of a world that had been bleached of its soul. It was the smell of absolute, unblinking efficiency. Behind them, the massive outer gates sealed with a sound like a final, rattling breath being exhaled by a dying god. The vibration hummed through the soles of Bailey's bare feet, traveling up her spine until it settled in her teeth. She didn't turn around. There was no point in looking back at the ruins of a life she could no longer touch. The walls here were tall enough that she could feel them pressing inward without ever raising her eyes, an immense, unyielding weight hemming her in on all sides. Above, the sky remained that same flawless mockery of a blue, unmarred by smoke or clouds, as indifferent as it had been the day the first nanobot was launched. It was a ceiling, not a sky. They were herded like cattle through wide paved streets lined with buildings that actually possessed glass in their window frames. Intact. Unscarred. They gleamed softly in the artificial, managed calm of the sector. People stopped to watch the new shipment pass. Not openly. There was no pointing, no jeering, no humanity in the observation. It was a clinical, quiet watching, the way a farmer might watch a delivery of grain. Alphas stood on street corners with narrowed eyes, their predatory gazes lingering a second too long on the Omegas in the line. Their nostrils flared, testing the air for traces of scent through the heavy chemical haze of the transport. Their bodies coiled with a tension that was only held in check by the black armored enforcers standing every 20 paces. Betas watched with something closer to a weary pity, or perhaps a selfish relief that it wasn't their turn to be processed. Other Omegas, marked with colored bands on their wrists, looked away entirely, their heads bowed as they hurried along designated footpaths, their spirits seemingly as filtered as the air they breathed. Bailey cataloged every detail with a scavenger's eye. She had learned long ago that information was the only currency that didn't devalue in the dirt. She saw the cameras. She saw the biometric scanners at every intersection. She saw the way the city was partitioned into concentric circles of increasing security. The enforcers, silent and imposing in their matte black gear, guided them toward a sprawling complex of concrete and burnished steel that sat slightly apart from the residential blocks. It was a low, heavy structure, its entrances flanked by high-definition scanners and guards who stood with the stillness of statues. The symbol of New Dawn was etched into the facade in deep, sharp relief, a rising sun breaking over a jagged, broken horizon. The processing center. The throat of the city. Inside, the temperature dropped several degrees, hitting Bailey's skin like a bucket of ice water. The air hummed with a low-frequency electricity and the quiet, terrifying authority of a place where every variable was accounted for. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering data streams on the wall monitors. Population densities, caloric distributions, movement logs. They weren't people here. They were assets, units of biological capital. The line of captives was fractured. Women were funneled into separate assessment rooms based on the initial scans from the checkpoint. Bailey was pushed into a stark, white-tiled chamber that smelled of industrial disinfectant and cold sweat. It contained a single metal chair bolted to the floor and a scanning arch that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic blue light. "Sit," an enforcer ordered. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to acknowledge her humanity to command her. She complied, her muscles coiled like rusted springs. A female beta technician entered, her expression as neutral as the walls. She wore a slate-gray uniform marked with a thin silver stripe, the mark of administrative authority. She didn't offer a name. She didn't offer comfort. She smelled of nothing at all, as if she'd been scrubbed clean in a vacuum. "Name," the woman said, her fingers dancing across a transparent tablet. "Bailey," she rasped, her voice sounding alien in the sterile quiet. "Age, 26. The woman glanced up, her eyes flicking over Bailey's gaunt face and the sharp lines of her collarbone. "Classification?" Bailey's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of lost hope. If she lied, would they know? The scanners were already humming, Omega, the technician nodded, a sharp, clinical movement. Presenting history? Late onset. Controlled, Bailey said, her voice growing firmer. The woman paused, her eyebrow arching in a rare display of surprise. Controlled how? You were found in an unregistered subsector. There were no medical supplies on record for that zone. No synthetic suppressants. Bailey met her gaze, refusing to blink. By necessity. I survived 10 years in the ruins. You learn to control what you have to when there's no doctor to do it for you. That earned her a longer, more invasive look. The technician didn't look impressed. She looked intrigued, like a scientist discovering a resilient strain of a virus in a petri dish. The scanning arch activated. It didn't just sweep over her. It felt as if it were peeling back her skin. A low, vibrating hum resonated in Bailey's marrow, making her teeth ache. Data began to cascade across the technician's tablet: hormonal levels, genetic markers, neural activity. The deep-seated signatures of her Omega biology that even 10 years of dirt couldn't hide. The woman frowned, her thumb scrolling through a particular graph. When was your last heat, Bailey? Bailey swallowed, the dryness in her throat like sandpaper. Almost a year ago. The technician stopped entirely, her fingers hovering over the screen. Without industrial-grade chemical inhibitors? That's biologically improbable for a healthy Omega in their prime. I didn't say I was healthy, Bailey countered. I didn't have enough food. Not consistently. For months at a time, I lived on scrap and rainwater. My body didn't have the resources to waste on a cycle. It went dormant to save my life. The woman's expression softened for a microsecond, a flicker of human recognition. A ghost of a memory of a time when people cared about the suffering of others, before the mask of new dawn slammed back into place. Malnutrition-induced dormancy. It's a documented survival mechanism in the wild, though rarely successful long-term without causing permanent damage to the reproductive system. She tapped a series of commands. Stand. Bailey rose, her legs shaking from the sudden effort. The scanner intensified, the light turning a harsh, blinding violet. It mapped her bone density, her lung capacity, the hidden scars on her thighs and back. It stripped her down to the most fundamental level, weighing her worth in a scale she couldn't see. Finally, the light died. The hum ceased, leaving a ringing silence that was almost as painful as the noise. High resilience, the technician murmured, speaking more to the data than the girl. Exceptional recovery potential, minimal genetic degradation, despite the environment. A prime candidate. Bailey's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. Where are you sending me? The technician hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the security camera in the corner of the room. You've been flagged. That decision is no longer within my purview. You're being moved to a higher security tier. 2 enforcers appeared at the door, their red visors gleaming like the eyes of insects. She's cleared. Move her to the inner sanctum. Bailey was escorted back into the main atrium, where the other Omegas were being sorted. The air here was thick with a new kind of tension, a heavy, suffocating weight that made the hair on her arms stand up. The scent of the city was changing. It no longer felt just sterile. It felt charged, like the air inside a pressurized chamber just before the glass shatters. Then she felt him. The suppressants they had pumped into her during transport were still a thick, numbing fog in her veins, but they couldn't block the sheer physical presence of what was approaching. It wasn't a smell, not yet. It was a shift in the atmospheric pressure. It was the feeling of an apex predator entering a small room, a presence so dense it seemed to pull all the light toward the center of the hall. She looked up, her breath hitching in her throat. A raised observation platform overlooked the atrium, and standing at its rail was a man who seemed to embody the city itself. Cold, structured, and immense. He was tall, broader than any man Bailey had seen in the ruins, his posture a study in absolute, terrifying control. He wore a dark, tailored uniform that lacked the garish insignia of the warlords she'd encountered. He didn't need medals to prove his rank. The power radiated off him in waves, cold, sharp, and undeniable. Alpha. The word echoed in her mind with a primal, ancestral dread. His hair was dark and cropped close to a skull of hard angles and severe lines. His face was a mask of stone, his expression one of detached, clinical observation. This was Cage. She didn't know the name yet, but she knew the gravity of him. This was the architect of the cage. This was the man who had replaced the chaos of the apocalypse with the silence of the machine. Cage's gaze moved methodically across the line of women, a harvester looking over his crop for the finest grain. Then his eyes hit hers. The effect was visceral, a physical blow to her solar plexus that stole the air from her lungs. Bailey's heart didn't just race, it slammed against her ribs with the force of a trapped animal. A heat she hadn't felt in a year flickered deep in her belly, a traitorous biological spark that she tried to stomp out with pure, concentrated hatred. Her Omega instincts, suppressed for so long by hunger and fear, bristled and snarled, sensing a dominance they could neither fight nor flee. On the platform, Cage's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the cold metal railing. He felt the pull like a hook in his chest, yanking him toward the girl in the rags. It was sharp, sudden, and entirely unwelcome. His alpha instincts, usually a well-trained weapon under his absolute command, surged with a primitive, demanding roar for recognition. For possession, for the scent of the woman standing in the dirt-streaked rags below. He had expected another shipment of broken things. He hadn't expected a challenge to his very nature. He broke eye contact first, his voice cutting through the silence of the hall. It was deep, resonant, and edged with the kind of authority that didn't permit the existence of an alternative. "Begin assignments," Cage commanded. "Prioritize stability and compatibility. I want the resilient ones moved to the inner spire for integration. No exceptions. Start with the one in the center." The administrators moved with renewed haste, the air vibrating with the Alpha's command. Bailey was pulled from the main group and shoved toward a smaller line, those deemed high-value assets. They were led through a labyrinth of secured corridors, moving deeper into the heart of the city. The architecture changed as they progressed, becoming more refined, more expensive. The cold concrete gave way to warmer tones of wood and stone. The harsh, blinking lights were replaced by soft, recessed glows that mimicked natural sunlight. The air grew even cleaner, filtered of every last trace of the outside world, smelling faintly of nothing but chilled metal and the ghost of a perfume she couldn't name. "This sector houses the primary residences," a guard explained, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. "You will live, work, and remain within your designated zones. Deviation results in immediate reassignment to the labor camps." "Work doing what?" Bailey asked, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. The enforcer glanced back at her, his red visor reflecting her own pale, defiant face. "Domestic operations. Caretaking. You're the lucky ones. You'll be maintaining the comfort of the city's elite. You'll be the grease in the gears of New Dawn." "Elite?" Bailey spat, the word tasting like ash. "You mean the alphas who couldn't survive without walls?" The guard stopped and turned, the silence in the hallway stretching thin and dangerous. He didn't strike her, that would damage the asset, but he leaned in until his visor was inches from her face. "There is no real world out there anymore, girl. Only dust and death. Here, you have a bed. You have food. You have a purpose. Don't throw it away for the sake of a mouthy tongue. You won't like the alternative." They stopped before a heavy, reinforced door marked Sector 1 primary residence. Inside, the space was a shock to the system. It looked human. It was a communal living area filled with clean, modern furniture, shelves of actual books, and even a few struggling green plants under UV lights. Private rooms lined the perimeter, each equipped with a bed, a sanitation unit, and individual climate control. It was the most beautiful place Bailey had seen in a decade, and it terrified her more than the ruins ever had. The ruins were honest. This place was a lie wrapped in silk. Bailey was shown to a small, immaculate room. On the bed lay fresh clothes, soft gray fabric that didn't smell like charcoal or chemical waste. A tray of food sat on the desk, real protein, fresh vegetables, and a piece of bread that was soft to the touch. She ate like an animal, her hands shaking as she shoved the food into her mouth. Her body, starved of nutrients for so long, responded with a greedy, frightening intensity. Warmth spread through her limbs. The constant, dull ache in her joints began to recede, replaced by a terrifying, blossoming strength. That night, lying on a mattress that didn't have springs poking through it, Bailey stared at the ceiling. She was safe. She was fed. She was clean, and she was more of a prisoner than she had ever been in the wild. The days that followed were a blur of structured, relentless routine. Bailey was assigned to the wellness checks for the younger Omegas, those who had been taken from the refugee camps and were still struggling with the transition. She watched as they were systematically broken and remade, their spirits traded for the security of New Dawn. She learned the rules of the Spire, when to bow, when to speak, and how to disappear into the background when an alpha passed. Cage was a constant, distant shadow. She saw him on the monitors that lined the hallways. She felt the shift in the guard's posture when he was in the building, a stiffening of the spine that signaled the arrival of the apex. She knew he was watching her, even when he wasn't there. He tracked her through the security feeds with a clinical, cold obsession. He noted the way she didn't slump like the others. He saw the way she looked at the walls, not with the hollow eyes of despair, but with the calculating eyes of someone measuring the height of the jump. She was not compliant. She was a splinter in the perfect machine he had built. One evening, after a 12-hour shift in the medical wing, Bailey returned to her room and caught her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her cheeks were no longer sunken. Her eyes were bright, the dull film of malnutrition entirely gone. She looked healthy. She looked strong. She looked like an omega ready for a mate. Then, she felt it, a faint, ominous pulse deep in her marrow, a heat that wasn't from the climate control. Her body, finally fueled by the city's resources and the clean, pressurized air, was waking up. The dormancy was over. The biological clock had started ticking again. Without suppressants, she was a ticking time bomb in a city full of gunpowder. In the heart of the central spire, 3 floors above her, Cage stood at a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the silent, blue-lit city. He felt the air change in the vents. He felt the phantom scent of something wild and forbidden drifting through the filtered air, a whisper of a promise he had tried to banish from his perfect world. The alpha in him growled, low and hungry, deep in his chest. He tightened his grip on the cold glass, his knuckles turning white as the perfect order of new dawn began to fray at the edges of his own control. The inner spire was a masterpiece of clinical isolation, a place where the air was filtered to a sterile perfection, and the silence was heavy enough to feel like a physical weight. But within the walls of the commander's private residence, that logic had been scorched away. For Bailey, the transition from the soot-stained tunnels of the Fringe to the polished luxury of the Spire had been a shock to the system, but it was nothing compared to the violent mutiny of her own biology. Her body was a traitor. It had been easier to be defiant when she was starving. Hunger was a clean, sharp pain she could wrap her identity around. But this awakening was a messy, internal coup. As her health returned, so did her cycle, and it didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived like a flash fire. She had spent the first 3 days of the cycle locked in the high-tech bedroom, her hair pulled into a ponytail so tight it made her scalp ache, her gray Omega armband glowing a frantic, warning crimson. She paced the room like a caged animal, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that rattled in her chest. Every time the ventilation hummed, she imagined it was the sound of his footsteps. Every time the amber lights of the city flickered outside the small window, she saw the reflection of his severe, stony face. Cage, the alpha who didn't just command the spire, but seemed to command the very molecules of the air she breathed. The haze didn't descend gradually. It slammed into her the moment the door hissed open, and Cage stepped inside. He didn't look like a commander in that moment. He looked like a man who had been pushed to the absolute edge of his ironclad control. His black military fatigues were unbuttoned at the throat, and his scent, sandalwood, gun oil, and a sharp, predatory musk, filled the room until Bailey felt like she was drowning. She didn't cower. Even as her knees shook, she bared her teeth. "Get out," she snarled, her voice a low, animalistic rasp. She was backed against the glass, her fingers clawing at the pane, as if she could dig her way through to the city below. Cage didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a physical force, an alpha dominance, that demanded a response from every cell in her body. He moved with a brutal, efficient grace, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. When he finally reached her, the collision was violent. There was no gentleness, no careful exploration of the kind the other Omegas whispered about. It was a clash of 2 stubborn, uncompromising wills. Bailey fought him, even as she stripped his shirt away, her teeth grazing his shoulder in a mixture of fury and desperate, starving need. Cage met her intensity with a domineering force, his large hands bruising her hips as he pinned her against the wall, his weight anchoring her. He wasn't the careful alpha she had feared. He was a storm, and Bailey was the lightning rod. Time ceased to be a linear concept. The amber lights of the city rose and fell beyond the window, marking days that Bailey only felt as shifts in the temperature of the room. They were trapped in a mating haze, a biological feedback loop that stripped away language, rank, and reason. The room became an ecosystem of 2, a world of salt, skin, and the heavy, sweet pheromones of a successful union. It was visceral. It was wild. It was a week-long war fought on the battlefield of a silk-sheeted bed. Bailey, driven by the frantic Omegan need to be claimed, was a whirlwind of motion, defiant even in her surrender. She didn't just take, she demanded. She bit, she scratched, and she sobbed his name like a curse. Cage was the anchor, his control not breaking but transforming into a focused, relentless intensity. He was a man who took what he wanted, but in the haze, what he wanted was to consume her entirely. He was the wall she broke herself against, the mountain that refused to move. A strange, primal intimacy began to form in the quiet moments between the storms. The haze didn't just bring lust, it brought a terrifyingly deep, wordless connection. Bailey, usually so fiercely independent, found herself spiraling into a state of total biological dependence. Her stubbornness manifested in a new, more dangerous way. She refused to eat. When the automated tray of fresh food, synthesized proteins, and vibrant fruits was delivered to the bedside, she turned her face away with a low growl. The very idea of the Spire's food felt like a violation of the bubble they had created. She wouldn't touch the tray. She wouldn't drink the water. She sat in the center of the bed, wrapped in his discarded uniform jacket, looking like a feral queen. She would only accept what came from his hand. It became a ritual that broke the commander's stony exterior. Cage sat on the edge of the bed, his own body showing the strain of the week, his jaw covered in a dark, thick stubble. He broke the bread himself, his massive fingers precise as he offered it to her. He held the water to her lips, his thumb stroking her jaw as she drank. This wasn't a submission of weakness, it was a submission of trust. She was forcing him to be her sole provider, her only source of life, binding him to her survival as much as he had bound her to his bed. He fed her like a prized, dangerous hawk, his expression softening into something unnameable as he watched her. In those moments, the commander was gone. There was only the Alpha and his Omega, bound by a week of sweat and blood. On the 7th night, the heat reached its final, agonizing crescendo. The awakening demanded a seal. The mating was no longer just a physical act. It was a desperate attempt to merge, to erase the line where one ended and the other began. Bailey was frantic, her legs locked around his waist, her fingers tangled in his hair as she pulled him closer, deeper, trying to draw him into her very soul. Now, she begged, her voice a broken thread of its former self. Cage now. Cage's control finally snapped with a guttural roar that vibrated through her chest. As he finally gave over to the peak, his biology took over. The base of his member expanded, the knot forming with a sudden, stretching fullness that made Bailey's eyes fly open and her breath hitch in a silent scream. She felt the pulse of him deep inside her, a rhythmic throb that sent waves of aftershocks through her exhausted frame. They were locked together, physically inseparable. The knot was the final anchor, the biological seal that ensured the union was absolute. They lay there for hours, the knot holding them in a forced, sweating embrace. Bailey's head was tucked under his chin, her heart thumping against his ribs in a frantic rhythm that eventually slowed to match his own. When the haze finally lifted on the 8th morning, the silence of the Spire felt alien, almost wrong. Bailey woke to find the room clean, the air filtered, and Cage standing by the small window, back in a fresh set of black fatigues. He looked like the commander again, severe, stony, unreachable. But when he turned to look at her, she saw the shadow of the week in the darkness of his eyes. She looked down at her wrist. The Omega armband was gone, discarded somewhere in the chaos. In its place was a faint, purple bruise from where he had held her, and a much deeper, more permanent mark on the side of her neck, where he had finally, during the height of the knotting, left his scent mark. She had survived the tunnels, she had survived the processing, but as she sat up in the bed of the man who had just spent a week consuming her, she realized the real fight was just beginning. The pregnancy test, administered by the room's sensors an hour later, didn't surprise her. The life was already there, a silent passenger in her womb. Bailey looked at the window, at the amber lights of the city she still dreamed of escaping, and felt the weight of the bond. Her body had been claimed, her hunger had been fed, but as she met Cage's gaze, her eyes remained as defiant as the day she had first looked up at him from the soot of the floor. Chapter 5. Laws Written in Blood. Bailey learned quickly that becoming Cage's mate did not mean becoming free. In fact, it felt like the walls had simply moved closer, painted in more expensive colors. The announcement of their union came without ceremony. There was no gathering in the high-arched halls of the Spire, no proclamation broadcast through New Dawn's sprawling networks to the thousands of souls living in the sectors below. The city did not celebrate bonds. It cataloged them with the cold efficiency of a ledger. Her status simply changed overnight in the digital system that governed every heartbeat in the city. When she glanced at the terminal in her new suite, she saw her name reimagined. Subject: Bailey. Omega, CLASS 7. Status: Registered Mate. Protected. Restricted. The final word burned the most. It sat there on the screen like a brand. A reminder that while she had survived the haze of the last week, she had not won the war. Her living quarters moved from the communal Omega residence wing, a place of shared breaths and whispered fears, to a private suite adjoining Cage's. It was a masterpiece of high-tech luxury. The floors were a warm, polished stone that didn't hold the chill of the morning. The bed was draped in heavy, charcoal gray silks that didn't chafe her skin or catch on the healing marks Cage had left on her neck. Every surface was clean, every corner illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that mimicked a perpetual dusk. But the luxury was a gilded cage. Medical scans became a daily ritual. Every morning, a silent medical droid would glide into her room, its blue optical sensor scanning her body for nutrient levels and hormonal spikes. The life growing inside her was no longer a secret. It was a priority of the state. Her meals were calibrated to the milligram, packed with synthetic proteins and prenatal supplements designed to sustain the next generation of the Spire's elite. And then came the rules. They were delivered not as a list, but as a series of shut doors. She could not leave the inner spire without an armed escort. She could not enter the outer markets alone. She could not return to her work in the archives, as her scent, now permanently altered by the bond, was deemed a disruption risk to the unregistered alphas in the lower tiers. Finally, there was the tracking band, a slim, obsidian-colored strip fused into the skin of her wrist. It didn't pulse like the Omega armband, it simply watched. Bailey argued every one of them. She fought with a feral intensity that the high-tech walls of the Spire seemed unequipped to handle. "You said I wouldn't be caged," she snapped one afternoon. She had tried to access the lift to the lower levels, only to have the system chime a polite, electronic denial. She stood in Cage's office now, her hair loose and messy, her feet bare on his expensive floors. She looked like a ghost of the Fringe, haunting a palace. "You promised me I wouldn't be a prisoner." Cage didn't look up from his holographic displays immediately. He was draped in his black uniform, the light from the maps casting sharp, angular shadows across his severe face. When he finally looked at her, his expression was stony, his eyes unreadable. "I promised you would not be owned," he replied, his voice a low, level vibration. "Not that the world would suddenly become safe for you. The world isn't safe because you built it that way," she shouted, her voice echoing off the glass. "You keep us in boxes and then wonder why we scream." "I keep you in boxes so you don't get torn apart," he countered, finally standing. He was a head taller than her, a mountain of alpha dominance that still made her blood sing despite her fury. "There is a difference between a cage and a fortress, Bailey. One day, you might learn to tell them apart." The distinction felt meaningless in her mouth, like ash from a fire that had long since burned out. Yet, despite the restrictions, or perhaps because of the friction they created, the intimacy between them didn't fade with the end of the heat. It intensified. It became a strange, volatile thing, born of two stubborn personalities, trapped in a beautiful vacuum. Bailey was often the one who crossed the invisible line first. She would find herself stepping into his office when he was deep in military reports, pressing her palms to his chest just to feel the thud of his heart, daring him to push her away. Sometimes he did, his jaw tight as he forced himself to focus on the city's logistics. Sometimes he didn't. When he didn't, the encounters were different from the wild, animalistic haze of the mating week. They were slower, heavier. There was a devastating awareness in the way he touched her now, a lingering caress along her jaw, a thumb tracing the mark on her neck. It unsettled her far more than the hunger ever had. She hated that her body still hummed at his touch. She hated that she wanted the very man who held her leash. But she hated most of all that, within the walls of their suite, he let her choose. He never demanded. He waited for her to bridge the gap, as if he knew that her pride was the only thing she had left, and he refused to break it. The incident in the market changed the architecture of her world. Bailey had been granted limited access to the inner market, the Spire's primary commercial square, provided she was accompanied by a 4-man enforcer detail. She had agreed, desperate for any air that wasn't recycled through Cage's ventilation system. The market was a vision of New Dawn's ideal. It was immaculate. Wide lanes of white stone, tiered stalls overflowing with lab-grown produce and precision-engineered textiles. Betas moved with quiet purpose. Registered alphas wore restraint collars, discreet silver bands that monitored their heart rates and released localized sedatives if their dominance spiked too high. Omegas worked in assigned roles, their scents neutralized by the heavy atmospheric scrubbers built into the ceiling. It was orderly. It was peaceful. It was a lie. Bailey felt the shift before it happened. It was a sudden, sharp ionization of the air, like the static before a lightning strike. The hum of the market dropped an octave. An Omega screamed. The sound was raw, high-pitched, and ancient. It cut through the manufactured peace like a serrated blade. Bailey's escorts reacted instantly, forming a perimeter around her, their hands hovering over their sidearms. The source of the sound was a young woman near a fruit stall. She was clutching her abdomen, her face flushed a violent red, her eyes wide and glassy with the onset of a spontaneous heat. She had no armband. No suppressants. Perhaps she had forgotten them. Perhaps she had tried to hide her cycle to avoid the very fate Bailey now lived. Her scent exploded outward, a sweet, cloying wave of jasmine and copper that hit the square like a physical blow. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Every alpha in the vicinity froze. The restraint collars on their necks began to whine, the high-pitched electronic protest filling the air as they struggled to compensate for the sudden massive surge of biological aggression. One alpha, a man in a merchant's tunic, snarled. It was a sound from the deep history of the species, primal and devoid of reason. He lunged toward the girl, his teeth bared. He was tackled by enforcers before he reached her, but the chaos was already spreading. Another alpha began to shake, his eyes turning black as the collar on his neck pulsed a frantic, blinding orange. He fought against the sedatives, his body a map of straining muscles. The Omega girl sobbed, backing away, her hands raised as if she could ward off the biology of the room. She slipped on the polished white stone and fell hard. The sound of her impact was swallowed by the rising roar of alphas losing their minds to the scent of a female in distress. Bailey watched, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it would break. For a split second, she saw it, the future she had demanded in her arguments with Cage. A world where everyone was free to roam, unmonitored and unrestrained. And she saw, with a clarity that made her sick, how quickly that world turned into a slaughterhouse. Enforcers flooded the square. They didn't use words, they used suppressants. Heavy canisters of gas hissed into the air, a thick gray mist that neutralized the scent and sent alphas and betas alike to their knees, gasping as their nervous systems were forcibly calmed. The Omega girl was covered in a heavy, scent-proof blanket, lifted like a piece of hazardous material, and whisked away through a side exit. The entire incident lasted less than 3 minutes. The gas cleared. The alphas were dragged away for recalibration. The market resumed its quiet, efficient hum. Bailey stood in the center of the square, shaking violently. Bile rose in her throat as she looked at the spot where the girl had fallen. "That's why," a voice said quietly beside her. She hadn't heard him approach. Cage stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the empty produce stall. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. "That girl would have been torn apart," he continued, his voice a low, controlled rasp. "Not because those men are evil, not because they hate her, but because the biology we were born with is a weapon that none of us truly knows how to aim." Bailey rounded on him, her fury and fear twisting together into a jagged knot. "Then why not fix the biology? Why not change the system? Why just build bigger walls?" "We tried," he said. The words were so simple, so defeated, that they stopped her cold. He didn't elaborate until much later that night. They were back in the Spire, the walls closed around them once again, the amber light of the city spilling across the floor like a pool of honey. Cage stood at the window, his silhouette dark against the glow. He told her about the early days, the years immediately following the collapse when the castes first began to emerge. Back then, the Spire didn't exist. There were no collars, no armbands, no restricted zones. There was only a desperate hope that discipline and old-world morality would be enough to govern the new biological reality. He told her about the refugee camp at Sector 4. An unregistered heat had triggered a mass aggression event in a crowded dormitory. It had turned into a riot that lasted 6 hours. By the time the military arrived, 300 people were dead. Most of them were Omegas. He told her about the night he buried his sister. She had been an Omega who believed in freedom above all else. She had cut off her armband and gone into the lower markets to prove a point. "The rules aren't a punishment, Bailey," Cage said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're scar tissue. Every law we have is written in the blood of someone we couldn't save." Bailey said nothing for a long time. She looked at her own tracking band, the obsidian strip that had felt like a shackle only hours before. It didn't feel like a gift now. It felt like a compromise. A terrible, bloody compromise. Understanding crept in slowly, unwillingly. It didn't erase her anger. It reframed it. She began to see the city differently. The enforcers weren't just brutes. They were barriers. The restrictions weren't just cages. They were fault lines mapped out to prevent the entire tectonic plate of their society from shifting and crushing everyone. New Dawn wasn't a kind place, but it was a living one, and Cage was the one who held it all together. She began to see the toll it took on him. She noticed the way he never truly slept through the night, his eyes snapping open at every shift in the building's vibrations. She saw the stacks of casualty reports he reviewed every morning, the endless logistical puzzles of keeping millions of alphas from killing each other. Leadership weighed on him like gravity, pulling his shoulders down, etching lines into his face that had nothing to do with age. One evening, as the city hummed outside, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked human, not a commander, not a mountain, just a man exhausted by the weight of the world. Without thinking, Bailey moved. She sat beside him, the movement drawing his attention. She reached out, her fingers finding his. He stiffened at first, surprised by the unprompted contact, but then his fingers slowly closed around hers. His hand was massive, warm, and slightly calloused. An understanding settled between them, not peace, not a surrender of her ideals, but something far more dangerous. It was an acceptance of the truth. The world was broken. The laws were blood-soaked. Every day was a series of hard choices and terrible compromises. Bailey still dreamed of the new Eden, the Omegas whispered about, a place where biology didn't dictate destiny. But as she sat there in the silence of the Spire, her hand in Cage's, she finally understood what it cost to build a world where a dream could even exist. The silence of the Spire had a weight to it that Bailey hadn't expected. In the Fringe, silence was a predator. It meant the enforcers had stopped their engines to listen for breathing, or a rival gang was creeping through the rusted ventilation shafts. It was a sharp, jagged thing, always balanced on the edge of a scream. But here, 40 floors above the smog and the perpetual grinding of the lower industrial gears, the silence was thick and suffocating, like being wrapped in layer upon layer of expensive silk until you could no longer feel your own skin. She had survived the starvation winters of her youth, where the only thing to eat was synthetic moss scraped from the damp undersides of the water mains. She had survived the Purge of 22, when the Alphas had cleared the lower tunnels with incendiary rounds, leaving the scent of scorched copper and burnt hair hanging in the air for months. She had survived the raids, the darkness, and the constant, vibrating hum of a world that wanted her dead. Bailey had survived worse than comfort. That was the cruel irony that gnawed at her now. In the tunnels, misery had been a simple, straightforward beast. Hunger gnawed at the stomach, fear sharpened the senses to a razor's edge, and survival demanded a constant, frantic motion that left no room for the luxury of reflection. There was no space to feel hollow, because being alive required every ounce of her will. Pain had a direction back then. It had a purpose. If your feet hurt, it was because you were moving towards safety. If your stomach cramped, it was a reminder that you were still breathing, still fighting, still human. In the Spire, misery had time. Her days were soft and empty in ways that made her chest ache with a dull, persistent throb. The private suite Cage had provided was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, warm, quiet, and filled with filtered air that tasted of absolutely nothing. No scent of ozone, no metallic tang of blood, no charcoal smoke from the communal heaters. Just a sterile, empty void. Food arrived on silent, floating trays at precisely the same intervals every day. There were nutritiously dense mashes, fresh fruits that looked too vibrant to be real, and proteins that lacked the recycled, rubbery texture of anything she'd ever eaten in the Fringe. She ate because her body demanded it, but the flavors felt like an insult to the memory of the girl who had once killed a man for a single tin of peaches. The doctors arrived in the afternoons, their lab coats so crisp and white they hurt her eyes. They smiled with a practiced, gentle empathy that never quite reached their eyes, speaking in low, modulated tones about maternal hormone balance and optimal fetal development. They spoke to her like she was a delicate piece of glass, or perhaps more accurately, a high-functioning incubator. They measured her vitals, tracked the growth of the life inside her, and nodded to one another with clinical satisfaction. The servants, mostly betas with vacant, downturned eyes, moved like shadows through the suite. They refreshed her linens and replaced her flowers without ever making a sound. They treated her like a holy relic and a prisoner all at once, avoiding her gaze as if she were a ghost they didn't want to accidentally summon. She was safe. And she was absolutely suffocating. Bailey woke every morning with the same tightness in her ribs, her lungs refusing to fully expand in the pressurized perfect air. She would spend hours walking the permitted corridors, her fingertips brushing against polished obsidian and cold white marble. She felt like a specter haunting someone else's life, a displaced soul in a palace built of steel and ego. Her reflection in the glass startled her more than the silence did. The woman looking back didn't have the hollow cheeks or the desperate, sunken eyes of the Fringe. Her skin was glowing. Her hair, once a matted mess of brunette tangles, was now sleek, healthy, and pulled into a neat, disciplined ponytail. She was filling out, her body softening and rounding with a pregnancy she had never asked for. She barely recognized the girl who had once known how to hide in the shadows. The only time she felt solid, the only time the ghost felt like a living woman, was when Cage touched her. It was a truth she resented almost as much as she needed it. It felt like a betrayal of every survival instinct she'd ever honed, yet her body responded to him before her mind could mount a defense. Their intimacy had shifted since the initial, drug-fueled haze of her arrival. The desperate, animalistic urgency had been replaced by something slower and infinitely more terrifying. Intentionality. Cage never took her without invitation now. He didn't have to. He simply occupied the space around her, a massive, silent presence that pulled at her like a gravity well. He watched her. He learned the specific cadence of her silences, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking of the tunnels, the way her hand instinctively went to her stomach when she felt a kick. He waited for the exact moment she reached her breaking point, the moment the isolation became too much and she finally crossed the invisible line between them. And when she finally did, when she reached out for him in the dark, it was like breathing after being underwater for a lifetime. She would press herself against the hard, muscled planes of his chest in the quiet hours of the morning, her fingers curling into his shirt. Cage would respond without a word, his large hands warm and steady, grounding her to the earth. He touched her like she mattered. Not like a prize won in a raid, or a resource to be harvested, but like a woman he intended to keep. His fingers would trace the faint, silvery scars on her thighs and back, the map of her life in the Fringe, as if he were memorizing her history, absorbing the pain she'd endured by sheer force of will. The sex was intense, but the frantic edge was gone. He took his time, learning her rhythms, tracing the contours of her changing body with a reverence that made her want to scream and weep simultaneously. In those moments, pleasure wasn't just a feeling. It was an anchor. It reminded her that she had a body, that she was more than just a political pawn. Sometimes, in the heavy afterglow, she would cry quiet, shaking tears. Cage never asked for an explanation. He just held her, his heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic reminder of the power he held over her, and the protection he offered. But the protection felt like a gilded cage, and the bars were beginning to close in. Cage noticed her decline, even if he didn't speak of it. He noticed the way her laughter had been replaced by a vacant stare, and how she stood for hours by the window, looking past the gleaming towers toward the hazy orange horizon. The name Eden had begun to circulate through the Spire like a persistent fever. It was a rumor whispered by the lower-level staff, a myth of a sanctuary beyond the controlled zones. They said it was a city where Omegas walked without tracking bands, where the old hierarchy had been dismantled. To Bailey, Eden was more than a rumor. It was a lifeline. "She's fading," she heard a medtech whisper one afternoon. "It's psychological. Omega wilting syndrome." Cage's voice had been a low growl in response. "Fix it." That night, Cage found her in the darkened observation lounge. "You're unhappy," he said simply. Bailey didn't turn around. "You're brilliant, Commander. Did you need a medical report to figure that out?" He stepped closer, his 6 feet 7 inches frame casting a long shadow over her. "You're miserable. You have everything. Why are you looking at the wasteland like it's a paradise?" She turned on him, fire flashing in her eyes. "You gave me everything, Cage. Everything except the one thing I actually asked for. Freedom." The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Finally, Cage spoke, his voice steady despite the tension. "When our child is born, you may leave. I will provide you with supplies and transport to the edge of the neutral zone. If Eden is where you wish to go, I will ensure you reach the border. The child stays. He will be my heir. But you will be free." The word free rang hollow. It should have been a victory, but it felt like a door slamming shut. The refugees arrived 2 weeks later. They were battered and thin, covered in the gray dust of the wastes. Bailey watched from the high gallery as the Omegas stepped off the transports, unmarked, without tracking bands, their eyes defiant. Hope flared in her chest, hot and painful. "They're from Eden," she whispered. But as the days passed, the stories began to fray. Cage ordered a private, off-the-record scan of the female refugees, and what they found was a nightmare. Eden did not suppress Omega biology with technology. It exploited it through brutal, natural means. Without the Spire's medical advancements, Omegas were forced into constant breeding cycles, their bodies breaking under the strain of continuous heat and labor. Children were taken at birth to be, quote, communal assets. Equality in Eden meant that everyone had an equal right to use you. Bailey felt the world tilt as she looked at the data. "It's a farm," she whispered. "It's just a farm," she confronted Cage that night, tears streaking her face. "You knew. You let me believe there was a way out." "I let you hope," he said, his expression weary, "because hope was the only thing keeping you alive. And hope belongs to you. It wasn't mine to take." She broke then, sobbing into his chest. New Dawn wasn't a paradise, but as she looked at the horror of Eden, she realized the truth. The Spire wasn't a cage. It was the only shield left in a dying world. Later, in the quiet of their bed, Cage spoke again. "My promise still stands. When the child is born, you may leave." Bailey looked at the man who had captured her, fed her, and now offered her the keys to her own destruction. Love stirred in her chest, unwelcome and heavy. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. She realized then that the hardest thing she'd ever have to survive wasn't the pain of the Fringe, but the choice to stay in the arms of the man who owned her world. Chapter 7. The Dawn. The revelation of Eden had been a shard of ice in Bailey's heart, melting slowly into a bitter understanding. The false paradise, a mirror reflecting the Spire's control but without its gilded veneer, had stripped away the last vestiges of her naive hope. But in its place, something unexpected had taken root. A fierce, primal sense of purpose. She was carrying a life, a future that, for the first time, felt irrevocably intertwined with the steel and glass of Cage's world. Her decision to stay, whispered into the darkness of their shared bed, had been a surrender not to subjugation, but to a different kind of strength. It wasn't the fiery, defiant strength of a lone wolf, but the quiet, enduring power of someone planting roots, choosing a difficult path for a deeper reason. Cage, for his part, had said nothing in response. He'd simply held her tighter, the silence a heavier, more complex language than any words could convey. It was the silence of a man who understood the weight of her choice, the sacrifice inherent in it, and the profound trust she was placing in him. The weeks that followed were marked by a subtle but profound shift in their dynamic. The tension that had coiled between them, a constant hum of resistance and control, began to dissipate. While Cage continued to manage the high-level politics and the heavy hand of the Alpha Council, Bailey found that she could no longer remain confined to the luxury of the upper suites. The wilting, the doctors had predicted, was cured not by rest but by action. She began to spend her days in the lower sectors, not as a prisoner and not as a politician, but as a ghost of the Fringe who finally had the power to change things. Cage had assigned her a discreet security detail, but he didn't stop her. He understood that she needed the dirt of the city beneath her fingernails to feel alive. Bailey oversaw the establishment of the New Dawn clinics. She used her knowledge of the tunnels to find the places where the betas and gammas were most neglected, repurposing old industrial hubs into clean, safe spaces for healthcare and communal dining. She didn't sit in council meetings debating percentages. She was on the ground, ensuring the nutrient mashes were actually reaching the hungry and that the air scrubbers were being maintained in the worker dormitories. Her pregnancy progressed, and with it, a new vulnerability settled over her. The constant ache in her back and the kicks that rippled beneath her skin were tangible realities. Yet, seeing the children in the lower sectors, healthier now, with fewer coughs and brighter eyes, gave her a fierce, territorial sense of peace. She was building a world for her child, one that didn't stop at the Spire's elevators. One evening, as she returned to their suite, her clothes dusted with the grit of the lower levels, Cage approached her. He looked at her disheveled hair and the glow of exhaustion on her face, and for the first time, he didn't look like a commander. He looked like a man in awe. "The child will be an alpha," he stated, his voice softer than usual as he helped her into a chair. "He will inherit the legacy of the Spire. But you are giving him a city worth inheriting." Bailey looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "I don't want him to just rule, Cage. I want him to lead." "There's a difference." He met her eyes. "I see that now." He reached out, his large hand gently covering hers on her stomach. "I made you a promise, Bailey. Freedom. I can't give you the lie of Eden, but I can give you the power to make this place real." The day her contractions began, it was sudden and fierce. Cage was immediately at her side, his usual composure fractured by a subtle panic. He stayed with her throughout the hours of labor, his presence unwavering. He was the anchor she clung to, as the pain threatened to pull her under. And then, a cry. Raw. Impossibly loud, and utterly perfect. Their son, Kale, was born with his father's dark hair and Bailey's defiant eyes. When Cage held him for the first time, the massive alpha looked almost fearful of his own strength, cradling the tiny life with a reverence that brought Bailey to tears. In the years that followed, the Spire changed. It wasn't through decrees alone, but through the bridge Bailey built between the heights and the depths. She became a legend in the lower sectors, the Lady of the Spire who actually walked among them. She didn't need a seat at the council table to exert power. She held the heart of the city in her hands. Their relationship matured into an unshakable partnership. Cage didn't try to control her. He relied on her perspective to keep him grounded. Their intimacy was no longer a struggle of wills, but a sanctuary of mutual respect. One evening, as they stood on their balcony watching the sun set over a city that was finally breathing, Bailey leaned into Cage's warmth. They weren't living a fairy tale, and the world was still a harsh, broken place. But as she watched Kale playing nearby and felt Cage's arm pull her close, she knew they had found something better than a dream. They had found the truth, and for the first time since the world ended, the dawn looked bright. I will rewrite the final chapter to conclude the story with Bailey